This is the screencast for Lesson 22 of Stephen's C# 24-hour trainer. This lesson focuses on using assertions to try to validate inputs and outputs and methods. And for this try it, we're going to be looking at this program which tries to take an average of these salary values. I have a program here that's all set to go. It's got a user interface, it's got a button which loads the values from that text box into an array of double, and then it calls the average salary method down here. All we need to do is add these assertions. So let's start with some sanity checks. First, we'll look at the array itself and make sure the array makes sense. If it's got no entries in it, or if it's got 1,000,000 entries in it, probably something is going wrong here. So then the question is, what do we want to do in those cases? Well, if the array is empty, there are no salaries in it, can this method calculate a valid result? The answer is no. You can't take an average of 0 items. So if the array has nothing in it, then something is probably wrong with the program, and even if this is a release build, we want to throw an exception so the main program can try to take action. So we'll just say if salaries.length is less than 1, we'll throw a new argument out of range exception. The parameter that's giving us trouble is salaries. And the message we're going to say is average salary cannot find average in empty array. Okay. So that makes sure we have a non-empty array. Now, depending on the application, you have to consider how big could the array be. If this is a really enormous program, a really enormous company, then it could be a big array. For a lot of companies, it won't. So let's just suppose maybe 100 is the maximum number of salaries that we expect to see. And then during testing, if we see a bigger number, then we can increase the test here. So in this case, suppose at runtime we do get an array that has 110 entries in it. The method can still produce a correct result, and that may be an unusual situation, but it still may be valid. So in this case, I'm not going to throw an argument out of a range exception. I'm just going to use a debug.assert. That way, during testing, if we encounter this problem, we can look closer at the code, make sure it's really not a problem. And then if in the final release build, if we get a whole lot of salaries in here, it won't be a problem. So we'll just say debug.assert. And then the condition we want to be true, so we'll say salaries.length less than or equal to 100. And then if there's a problem, what message do we want to display? Let's just say array too big. Debug.assert messages can be a little bit terser than the ones that you would throw with an exception, because if this thing happens, it's going to interrupt execution and put the debugger right at the line that caused the problem. So it'll stop right here, and a programmer can take a look at this. They know they're in the average salary routine. They can look at the assertion. It's in the message actually also, so they can try to figure out what's going wrong. So now we think that the array is reasonable. Let's look at the values in the array. We want to check these salaries, make sure that they're reasonable. So I'm just going to loop through the array for int I equals 0, I less than salaries.length, I plus. Let's check one of the salaries. Now again, we need to ask ourselves, suppose we get a weird salary in here, maybe it's $10. Is that an invalid value that could never conceivably enter the program? Or is that just very strange and we should suspect that there might be a bug, maybe take a look at the code? In this case, it could be that the employer hired an intern for a week at $20 an hour, so the salary is only $1,600 instead of the $10,000 or more that you would normally expect. So I can envision situations that are kind of unusual where a low salary might be valid. Similarly, you might have a really huge salary. You'll have to decide, depending on your application, whether a $1 million salary is so unusual that it actually is an error, or whether it's just a condition that you want to take a look at. So we'll use debug.assert here. I want to ensure that salaries of I is greater than or equal to 10,000. That seems like a good sanity check. And if it's not, we'll just say salary too big. And then similarly, we'll check that salaries of I is less than 1 million. And sorry, if salaries is, we want this to be greater than or equal to 10,000, and if it's not, it's too small. And if it's not less than 1 million, then it's too big. Okay, so those are our input assertions. Now, after we calculate the result, it's often useful to have a little sanity check there, just to make sure the result makes sense. If we get an average salary that's really huge or really small, that's probably an indication of an error also. If the array has a bunch of salaries in it, the odds are the average will be more reasonable if those salaries are reasonable. So even if there's one really weird one in there, the result will probably be okay. But in any case, we still may have those unusual situations, so I don't want to treat this as an error so much as a suspicious circumstance. So I'm going to use debug.assert. I'm going to assert that the result is at least 10,000, greater than or equal to 10,000. And if it's not, I'm going to say average salary too small. We'll also check that the average is less than 1 million. And if it's not, we'll complain that it's too big. All right, so let's run the program, see what happens. All right, here are some salaries that make sense. If we calculate, we get a reasonable average. Let's make this one really small. We'll make it 9,000. And we get this huge assertion failure message. I'm sorry this doesn't fit all the way on the screencast, but it's got a lot of information you don't particularly need. The key up here is it says salary too small, and it gives you a bunch of information about where you are in the code. At the very top it says at form1.average salary decimal salaries. So that's telling us we're in this average salary method. And then the stuff down here tells you what called that method and so on. If you look in the title bar, it says assertion failed, abort equals quit, retry equals debug, ignore equal continue. So if you want to ignore this area and keep running, you just click the ignore button, which is down at the bottom, chopped off the screen here. If you want to stop the program and quit, you click abort. And if you want to debug the program, you pick retry. So I'm going to click retry. And it takes us right to the assertion statement that failed. So now we can take a look in the code, and you can see we're in the debugger. We can look at these values, salaries, open it up, take a look around in here. We can look at I is 0. Let's take a look at what salaries of I is. It's 9,000. Okay, so eventually you should be able to figure out what the error is, and then you can decide whether this is a real bug or whether it's just strange data. So I'm going to continue running the program. I'll press F5 so it'll keep going. And everything aside from that assertion was okay. Let's make a value in here that's going to cause a different kind of error. So I'm going to put in 10,000 and calculate just to make sure that's okay. I'm going to copy that and paste it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. Then I'm going to copy all of that and paste it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. So hopefully I've got 100 entries in there. If I click calculate, it says input string in incorrect format. So what did I do wrong? Oh, there we go. I think it was just that trailing space confused it. It tried to make an entry that was blank and then turn it into a decimal, and that failed. So now we have 100 items in this array, and I can calculate successfully. Let me add one more here to the beginning. Another 10,000 item, $10,000 salary, calculate, and we get an assertion again that says array too big. All right, in this case I'm going to ignore it and continue running so the program can keep going. And that's about it for this example. There's one more odd case I would like to mention briefly. There's a chance that the average salary method is called with a salaries parameter that's actually null. It's not just an empty array, it's not even an array at all, it's just nothing. Okay? In that case, what happens is when it gets to this statement, the code will try to see what the array's length is, and it'll complain because it can't find the length of a null variable, a null parameter. So what will happen is when the code tries to execute that statement, it'll throw an error. It'll throw an exception. Now you can decide how you want to handle this. A lot of programmers will just let the exception take care of itself. They'll let the program throw this exception without checking for it. You could check for it yourself and say if salaries equals null then, and throw your own exception. There isn't a whole lot of difference there. Perhaps the main difference is whether you expect that to be a regular occurrence or not. If you think it might happen in real life, then you may want to catch it so you can throw an exception that's more descriptive, so you can tell the programmer who is calling your code this error happened in average salary. The problem is the salary's parameter is not null. So let me show you what happens if we don't bother to catch the exception. I've got a couple of test cases up here that I put into the code just so we can try this. This one passes in an empty array. You can see it says new decimal array, and then it uses the curly brackets to initialize the array, but it doesn't put any values in there, so we get an empty array. And this version actually passes null in, so let's try that version. Doesn't really matter what we enter here. I'll just click the calculate button. And the error that it threw was object reference not set to an instance of an object. This is true, and it tells you that something in here somewhere you had a reference variable that was null when it shouldn't have been, but it doesn't really tell you where. So in this case, if you expect this error to occur, you might want to catch for it explicitly so that you can throw that more descriptive message. That's about it for this example.